welcome once again to Ewtn's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Ramona Trevino, and the author of Redeemed by Grace. It's a book published by Ignatius Press, available through the Ewtn Religious Catalog, subtitled A Catholic Woman's Journey to Planned Parenthood and Back. Welcome, Ramona. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
People would have seen you back in around Thanksgiving time or in the middle of November back on Jim and Joy Pinto's program, and so they'll remember you from that. And we have by the time they get to see this wonderful book interview. Now you've got an interesting story here too, because we've kind of had this situation like with the other book that came out about this, where somebody's leaving Planned Parenthood and coming out. Your story in some ways is a little different than some of the other people I've read about. There's been the abortionists who come out, and then people who worked directly in an abortion mill, let's say. But in your case, you were kind of more on the periphery of what was going on, and it's an interesting way that you kind of talk about how you rationalize that for yourself. Is that why this book is different?
Yeah, I believe so. I think there's always going to be that parallel with other, former abortion workers, especially like with Abby Johnson.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people question, how is this story different? And I think it's different in many ways. One, it does talk about working at a non-abortion facility, and there's this other side of Planned Parenthood that so many people support, and they really justify their work through this type of Planned Parenthood clinic that I worked at.
And that's the kind of a clinic that, quote unquote, would give contraception and abortion referrals, but they wouldn't actually be done there, right?
Correct.
And that was a way for you to feel like, well, I'm not really directly involved with that. But as you say in your book, the first time you realized that somebody was positive for a pregnancy test, you go, hey, isn't that terrific? And get the face and realize, oh, when I look at the sheet, she came in here for an abortion.
Right. She wanted an abortion referral. And I was still fairly new, so I wasn't really sure on all the protocol and the steps that I needed to take, and really overlooking that she wanted an abortion referral. And when I made that first abortion referral, that's when I realized that I was making justifications, and I think in reality, the reality didn't set in until that moment that I was actually going to facilitate in some way with abortion.
Now, it's interesting. You've got Lauren Muzica, Executive Director, Sidewalk Advocates for Life, former 40 Days for Life National Campaign Strategist. She writes the foreword, but it's not just a connection in the sense that because she's involved with the pro-life movement, she's directly involved with your story, right?
Absolutely. She's one of my dearest friends, and she actually is the godmother of our youngest son, Philip. But she, because of her role in 40 Days for Life at the time, she was directly involved with me in helping me leave Planned Parenthood. So she's very instrumental in this story.
Now, she actually was the person who actually reached out to you. Is that what it was? Did she call you?
She did.
Okay.
She initially, when I went out to ask for prayers from the folks out on the sidewalk, they're the ones who connected me with Lauren, and then Lauren called, and after that we just began to talk, and she allowed me to kind of sort through all of my feelings and kind of what was going on with me internally. And so she was a great help in helping me leave.
Now, she writes in the beginning, she kind of talks about that relationship and how that came about. But she also says, talking about you, I know you struggle with writing the pages that follow, but you did it because of your great hope that it could touch others who might be wondering if something better awaits them too. Was it hard for you to write this book?
It was very difficult.
Okay.
There was definitely the spiritual attack during the whole process. Also, I think emotionally, I had to reconcile a lot of things in my past that were not just connected to Planned Parenthood. So even just in my first marriage and some of the things in my childhood that I had to relive, but I just felt it was so important because so many people experience that type of brokenness in their life.
Now, so who's Roxanne?
Roxanne is another dear friend. She's the writer of Redeemed by Grace, also a godmother of my youngest baby. But the Lord brought her into our life as well, and I just think it's just.
So you worked with her on the book then?
I did, yeah.
Okay.
She was the one that wrote the book for me, and I don't think anyone else could have done a better job.
Okay. Well, let me ask you too, because so was it her decision then? Because kind of the style of the book is you start off here April 2011 talking about being into Planned Parenthood, and then you kind of at different times come back up to date, but go back in time to when you were a child growing up and realizing that obviously there was issues in your family. I guess your dad's drinking. He was also a disabled veteran from Vietnam, which I'm sure had an impact on that as well. And then was that her decision, your decision, Ignatius Press? Who decided to kind of format the book that way?
I think when Roxanne and I initially interviewed, and she interviewed me and just kind of got the backstory, we realized that there was a history that needed to be told that would allow the reader to kind of journey through someone's life and say, okay, this is kind of how someone ends up at Planned Parenthood, because the biggest question I always get asked is, how in the world did you end up at Planned Parenthood? But I think it was important to kind of give the reader that backstory, because I think we all have a story to tell.
Right. So you had a broken home. Let's say at one time your mom tried to take care of you. Obviously, you spent a lot of time with your grandparents, right, who lived next door.
We actually lived with my grandparents growing up. Yeah, my mom and dad. Thankfully, my mom and dad never divorced, and so we had. We had them, our whole lives. But it was difficult.
So when you talk about the
Beaver.
images of your dad walking out the door, that was something you thought was going to happen that never really happened.
Right.
Okay, I got that. Okay, so and then you got later on. You always wanted to be a sister. You thought you wanted to be a religious. You got yourself involved, unfortunately, with a young man who came up from Mexico, and you ended up in a situation that made it more difficult for you. And you ultimately got pregnant and got married. Did you ever think about having an abortion when you got pregnant?
No.
Okay.
It was unthinkable for me. And now looking back, I think, wow, how did someone like me end up at Planned Parenthood? And the thing is, my parents never even brought up the issue of abortion. So there was a lot of support in my family when I became pregnant, even though I was so young.
So you would describe yourself probably at the time as what, a marginal Catholic still, a cultural Catholic?
We were more cultural because I was a cradle Catholic, so I was baptized Catholic, but we didn't live out our faith.
Right. Did you go to church and Christmas
on
and
occasion,
Easter once
yes.
in a while, right?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, not atypical. So what's interesting too is, so when you went to work, we'll talk a little bit how you ended up at Planned Parenthood. Was there a reaction from anybody in your family about you working there, or did it just seem like, well, like it did to you, well, good, this is a job. In fact, I'm going to be a manager. This will be good.
Right. No one reacted. I think because we grew up in such a small little town, we were sheltered from the reality of who Planned Parenthood is. And so, the only thing that we knew of Planned Parenthood was that they were an affordable, low-cost sort of gynecologist office, right, for uninsured women. And so that was kind of the thought.
So we're helping the poor.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was something, like my mom was like, I went to Planned Parenthood when I was young, and didn't think anything of it.
Right.
It's because that's the side of Planned Parenthood that Planned Parenthood wants us to see.
Right, exactly. Now, what's interesting here too, and also ties directly in to Ewtn, you talk about the fact that at one point in the beginning in here you say, God help me understand, why haven't you shown me the way out? And then you say, I wanted to listen again to the Catholic station I had discovered just 4 months earlier. So you started, so how did you come across, and you talk about it later in the book about kind of coming across Catholic radio. What was that experience like, and why did that touch you?
That was where the first seed was planted. It was December of 2010 when I first heard Catholic radio for the first time. I stumbled across it, and I was sitting in a Walmart parking lot doing some Christmas shopping, and that's when I first heard for the first time the word abortifacient. I had never heard that term before. And so that, I always go back to that moment thinking, this was the aha moment for me, in which I was able to start connecting the dots with what I was doing at Planned Parenthood, and then later on connecting it to in how I was facilitating with abortion.
Yeah, because you said Catholic radio had been haunting me. Birth control is the gateway to abortion, was being said. You said, here I go. I said with a sigh, I turned the dial to 910 AM Guadalupe Radio Network, our great friends in Guadalupe Radio, landing in the middle of a now familiar show called The Good Fight with our great friend and host Barbara McGuigan, of course, The Good Fight. And Barbara's a great pro-lifer for many years, and she's not shy. She's not shy. She steps out there and she said, you know, one day we're all going to stand before God, and I believe he's going to say, what did you do? And you said, I cringed at that moment, and it was as if God was speaking to me through Barbara.
That was, it still brings tears to my eyes to think about it, because it was just such an impactful moment. Really, I think would define me for the rest of my life. Those words that she expressed to this gentleman who had called in, because it was so challenging. And I think that was the kind of the aha moment that I needed in order for me to realize I have to leave this organization. I have to leave Planned Parenthood. Because prior to that, I was trying to figure out how and when I was going to do that. I thought, okay, I need to have another job lined up. It was not a sense of urgency there. But those words for me, you know, I really truly felt like God was speaking through her to me, saying, you know, you knew about abortion, and what did you do? And so no longer could I justify what I was doing at Planned Parenthood by saying, well, I'm working in this gray area, you know, I'm not really hands-on with abortion. And I think that's the problem that so many of us face in this culture, is that we think we're not necessarily directly involved with abortion because we don't have anything to do with it. But just in what we fail to do is enough for God to say, but you knew.
Yeah, I have nothing. That's the answer, Ramona. You've done nothing at all to stop it. Far from it. You've done many, many things to make it possible. Yes, you've been leading babies along with their mothers to their deaths, if not of the body, then of the soul. You are culpable. Now was that an inner feeling you had? Is that just what your conscience said to you?
Yes, those were all the emotions that I was feeling at that moment as I was hearing those words, and recognizing that, oh my goodness, you know, my hands aren't clean. You know, I do have blood on my hands. Right.
You said, how could I have been so blind? How could I have not seen that I was accomplice this whole time? And you use this line, and I have to say, my own personal experience when I came to realize about, you know, if abortion is really wrong, which I thought it was, then it can't be good for anybody. And you use the same phrase. It's as if the scales are falling from my eyes. And that's exactly what happens. You get this moment, and they drop off, and suddenly the world looks different.
Yes.
And you say to yourself, how could I, like you said, how could I be so blind? How could I think this before?
Right. Absolutely. You know, it's amazing. I do look back at my life and go, you know, there is definitely some blurry vision going on there in the past, right? Things that you thought were, they're okay. Who am I to judge? Who am I to say to a woman what she can do with her body? And then when you do have those scales fall from your eyes, you look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, all of that, the societal message of tolerance and non-judgmental things, which are supposed to be good, but they sound good when you say them, but at the end of the day, the results aren't so good. One of the things that's powerful in your book, too, is right in the beginning here, which is really, I guess, the message of the book, which it's not too late, right?
That's right. I think, you know, again, I think that anyone can relate to this story. They don't have to necessarily be staunch pro-lifers or, you know, actively involved in the pro-life effort. Hopefully that this would, you know, allow them to kind of re-examine that. But I think we all have a past, and we all have things that we need to reconcile with God. And I think for anyone, you know, it's never too late to be redeemed, and it's of course redeemed by grace, you know, by the grace of God. And I think that's really why I wanted to tell this story, because I think so many people can see different things. I've had so many people tell me, you know, I saw myself in this part of your life or that part of your life.
Right. Well, what's nice about it is it's dynamic, but yet it's relatable. It's something that's a little different, but there's enough in there to say, you know, I easily could have found myself in the same situation, or did at different times find myself in the same situation. And this is a great point you make. God has never walked away from me. I was the one who had drifted. And that is so much of, I think, what many of us, even, you know, cradle Catholics or Catholics who think of themselves as being, you know, I'm a good Catholic. I go to Mass, you know, most of the time and whatever. But I don't want to judge, and, you know, I'm not in favor of abortion, but, you know, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think that we always get into trouble when we hear, I don't favor abortion, or I don't believe in abortion, but. You know, when we hear the word but, we need to pause and rethink and re-examine.
Earlier in your life, you talk about an episode where a metal ladder is very important. What was that?
Yes, when I was a little girl, probably around 7 or 8 years old, I remember my mom and dad were arguing, and there was a ladder that we were remodeling our home, and so there was a ladder, up against the house, and I climbed up that ladder. And I just remember wanting to be close to God, and I talked to God, and that was kind of my earliest memory in my life of God affirming to me that He's real. Because I remember just kind of looking up to the sky and saying, God, if you're real, if you can hear me, show me a sign. And then the sky lit up, and with lightning. And I just always felt this deep sense of peace, being able to go back to that memory. It's kind of interesting because I think there was a period of time in my life where I'd forgotten about that.
Right.
But then to be able to revisit that in the book, it's so profound.
Well, you also talk about here, it's at one point you say, it seemed the soil of my life was being tilled, it was turning and changing, being readied for something new, something to help me to believe in myself again. But of course, obviously, you ended up with a lot of other adventures before that. Are you still experiencing that now in your life?
No, not so much. I think now more than ever, it's just been a spiritual battle. I can see myself growing spiritually in the past 4 years since I left Planned Parenthood. It's definitely been a journey, but one of spirituality and being more devout in my faith. But I don't feel lost anymore. I kind of know the path that I'm supposed to be on, although I don't know where that's going to lead me.
Right.
But I do. I'm more secure in my walk with God now.
Right, and also what helped you was you ended up meeting a man named Eugene who you ended up marrying. It says, it was interesting because you say, I quickly learned that Eugene had dreamed of being married in the Catholic Church. Why? And that ultimately got you guys back involved. But it says here that you began classes to enter the church formally. So though you were a cultural Catholic, had you not gone through all the sacraments? Is that what it was?
Yeah, no, neither one of us. I think he had gone through his first communion, but neither one of us had been. I had not had my first communion.
Okay, so you were baptized, and that was basically it. Okay.
Right. So that was a true gift for me to meet someone who had that desire, because I also had that desire. I had not been married in the church before, and so that was really the longing of my heart. So to meet someone really in this day and age who desired that, especially in my own experience, to find someone who wanted that as well, it was a blessing.
Now, one of the things you talk about is how you got involved, and at one point in time you were Ramona, the manager. That has a nice ring to it. And they asked you a question when they hired you: how do you feel about Plan B? And you were like, well, kind of what's Plan B?
Right.
There's Plan A and Plan B. So,
right.
But she was talking about the emergency contraceptive, which is an abortifacient.
Right. Yeah, I didn't even know what it was, and I thought, okay, well, let me make something up on the spot here and make it sound good so that I can get the job, because I was more interested in getting the job than really knowing and understanding what I was getting myself into.
Now, did you ever, how long were you actually there now there was 2 different centers you were working at?
I actually worked in one in Sherman,
Okay.
And the other center was in McKinney that I would cover for.
Okay. Now, did Nancy work there?
She did.
Talk about in the
she
book?
worked there, and so when she would, take
She
vacation
was also Catholic, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Now, did you ever, since you didn't seem like you were at least initially, being enthusiastic and pushing abortion on these young women, did you ever have anybody, get concerned that you weren't being positive enough about that being an option?
No, because we really didn't have anyone ever visit our clinics. So they were more concerned with the kind of like the Dallas-Fort Worth area versus the outer lining clinics where we were located.
But there was a point, wasn't there at one point where they decided that they were having like a campaign or a contest to raise up the use of one of the morning after pill, right?
Right. Yeah, we had, I think it was just a large backstock of Plan B, and it was going to expire. So we needed to, they decided to.
So they're discounting it.
Discount it, and then
there.
not only that, but a contest to see who would sell the most Plan B, and whichever clinic sold the most, then each employee would get a $50 Visa gift card.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, who are the girls of Grace and Is it Grayson County?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Who are they?
Grayson County is the county in which my sermon clinic was located. And I was called upon to, actually it was someone from the juvenile detention who called and asked if we offered any type of educational service for the young girls there. Interestingly enough, Planned Parenthood does offer that, but they didn't have anyone to send out that far. They said, we don't send anyone out that far away from the Dallas Metroplex. So I thought that was interesting that, you know, that they champion themselves on sexual education and things like that, but yet when it came to this situation, they didn't want to send anyone.
Right.
So I volunteered myself,
Right.
and I went and spoke to these young ladies at the detention center there. And it actually ends up being one of my favorite chapters in the book. I just think it's so telling of who Planned Parenthood is, and not only that, but the need that these young people have for the truth with capital T. You know, not the truth that the culture is trying to feed them. And at the end of that that engagement that I had with these young girls, I couldn't walk away without telling them that God loved them. And that was just really something that kind of took me by surprise, because I didn't know where that came from. It wasn't part of the script whatsoever. And so I think I just walked out of there with a heavy heart, but also, you know, a hopeful heart too, because hoping that maybe something that I said would stay with them.
Right. Who's Father Cruz?
Father Cruz is the priest whom I confessed to about working at Planned Parenthood. And he holds a special place in my heart as well because of the way he reacted. You know, I think, you know, going into the confessional and saying, you know, I work for Planned Parenthood, but yet, you know, I'm Catholic and I come to Mass, it's pretty scary. And so, you know, he had some beautiful words to say to me, and very supportive. And I think it was just a great relief.
Right, but he also told you, that's great, you made a great confession,
But you need to get out.
you need to get out of there.
Yes.
And again, I think that's the true understanding of what the Holy Father talks about in the sense of mercy and accompaniment, which is, the mercy is, yes, my daughter, you're forgiven. The accompaniment is, I'm going to help you get out of this situation. Right. I'm not going to say, you're forgiven, isn't it a wonderful confession, go back and do what you're doing.
Right.
It's not right, right? It's really challenging us to stand up for the things and say, if I'm really confessing this, am I going to live this out now?
Yeah, we need to turn away from this.
Or is it just words for me too? You said at one point, yes, Jesus, I know you've got my back. I do trust in you. What was the moment that you were able to say that?
Is this in the Divine Mercy chapter?
Yes,
probably?
right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
That was the day of Divine Mercy Sunday, 2011. And that was the day that I was sitting in the pews, and I really truly heard God speak to me and saying, you know, have faith in me, trust in me. And that something completely miraculous happened that day. I don't even know how to explain it, but I do the best we can in the book.
Sure.
But it really becomes, it came down to me being able to take that final leap of faith and just saying, you know, I know that you've always been there for me and you've never failed me before. You're not going to fail me now, you know, and then I was able to take that leap.
Right. And you could see throughout your life story, through the ups and downs, God was always there.
Always there.
When you reached out for him, and he did help you along the way. And I remember a great friend of ours, Father George Kosicki, who was a great promoter of Divine Mercy, used to always write in books, trust even more. That was his line. So whose idea was it to actually do this book?
It was mine.
It was.
You know, I would think it was mine. I spent a lot of time discerning. Many people had come to me and said, you know, you should write a book, or you should consider it. And I didn't consider it. But I think, again, you know, those little seeds are planted wherever you go. And so many people felt like there was, you know, more to the story than just I walked out of Planned Parenthood.
Right.
And so in that discernment process, I felt like God was calling me to glorify him, glorify his church, to definitely tell this story from a Catholic perspective, because I think you can tell it from, you know, a non-denominational perspective, but I felt like because the sacraments are so instrumental in the story, and really my faith is just so important to me, that I felt like I had to tell it from a Catholic perspective. And with that, you know, I just felt like Jesus was calling me to tell this story and to share something that is the other side of abortion issue, which is the also to kind of challenge people about contraception.
Right, and how it is the gateway to that, and that how that tends to be the kind of thing we kind of, oh, well, that's not quite the same. And you even talk about in the book the idea of putting your blinders up, right? And saying, well, I kind of don't really see this because this is disturbing to me.
Right,
So
right.
we
And I
kinda
think
do
so
that.
many times we, and it is going to be challenging for many Catholics because of the number of Catholics who do contracept. So I think there is going to be that challenge there, but I don't tell it from the perspective of this is what you have to do.
Right.
I'm telling it from the perspective I experienced this, and maybe you should kind of take a look inside
Right,
and
yourself and maybe talk to the Lord and see what He has to say to you.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Ramona. Great to
Thank
have you
you.
here. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
Speaking with Ramona Trevino, author of Redeemed by Grace, A Catholic Woman's Journey to Planned Parenthood and Back, published by Ignatius Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Check it out. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.